the University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Welcome to I think this is our 5th brown bag session for the year. We've had a host of speakers. Our previous speaker also spoke about research for social impact. Today, our speaker is Prof. Ruth Stewart. Prof. Ruth Stewart is the director of the University of Johannesburg's Africa Center for Evidence and chairperson of the Africa Evidence Network. Having grown up in Malawi, she studied in the UK and has worked in South Africa since 1998. Her work includes the production of evidence for decision makers, as well as supporting decision makers to access and make sense of research. She is committed to making a difference through her work by ensuring that research evidence is useful and used.
So if I can kickstart from there, my name is Andrew Kaniki. I will be facilitating this one of these very exciting, brown bag, conversations on research for social impact. As you know, and of course, not only do governments now and every one of us are insisting on the fact that the research that is done or being conducted, there's some evidence of what it is that it does for us. So it's a great pleasure to have Ruth to make a presentation to us, and of course for us to engage with her. Let me just ask from the outset that if we can all mute our microphones while the presentation is on and when we are engaging. And then, of course, when Ruth completes her presentation, we will have question time and comments. And so when you are ready to ask a question, you can raise your hand. If I can't see you, you can just jump in, and then we will have that kind of conversation. So we are given about an hour and a half. If we finish early, well and good, but I would imagine that there's more excitement in all of us to try and understand how best we can do that. So let me hand you over to Ruth, and then we'll come back to my, handling the questions and answers. Over to you, Ruth. I'll switch off my camera for now.
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. And I think we're all suffering a little from load shedding and cold weather, so entirely understand. Greetings, colleagues. I hope you're sitting comfortably. I have some presentation for you today, and I'm also, I built in almost a pause for some discussion when I'm kind of 2/3 of the way through, so we can see a little bit what direction you'd like to go in before I wrap up. And perhaps you just rather discuss, let's see how we get on. So I'm here to talk about research for social impact. Let me just see if this is going to scroll for us. Yeah, so this is what I have prepared for us. I've got, would love to take a bit of time for some introductions to say a little bit about my work, but also through the chat to hear a little bit more about you. I want to talk a bit about why I think things are not okay and why I think this work's important. To tell you a little bit about how ACE, the Africa Centre for Evidence, which I lead, works to try and increase the societal impact of scientific knowledge. And then I've got some approaches and examples and a chance for some reflection and Q&A and some more details should we want it a little bit later on. So let's jump into learning a little bit more about each other. And I'm sure many of you have given talks on Zoom and Teams and all these platforms since the pandemic began. And it feels a bit like this, right? You're looking at a black screen, you have no idea who's out there. And I'd love to learn a little bit more about you. So some of you will know there's a children's book about a witch and on a broom. And there's a little quote here from the Julia Donaldson book, Iggity, ziggity, zaggity, zoom, I really want to know who's in my room. So I'd like to hear a bit more about you. And I wonder if we can use the chat. I need to find out how I can see the chat. So I have some questions for you. The first one I wanted to ask was around whether or not you're the kind of person who has a woolly hat on or a heater on. And I'd love you to pop in the chat. Tell us, are you sitting there huddled around a little gas heater, or are you huddled in next to a with a woolly hat on like I am. Now, why can't I see our chat? I was really hoping I'd be able to see what you shared. Up there it is, fantastic. So, somebody with a beanie and a heater and a coat. Oh, I'm jealous already. Woolly hats? Neither. Oh my goodness, Ada, we need to send you something. Please keep warm. Okay, so that was my first question. But really, I'd also like to know. Please keep telling us how you're keeping warm. Oh, Pooh Bear, you see, I'm learning about you already. This is very revealing in good ways. I'd love to know where you are. So once you've told us how you're keeping warm, tell us a bit about where you are. I'm assuming you're all in South Africa, but you're welcome to tell me that I'm wrong. I'd love to know what city you're in. Somebody's got the air conditioning on. You can't be in South Africa with air conditioning on. That couldn't be possible. But please do also pop in the chat there something about where you're based today. Brilliant. So there's some fellow Joburgers here as well. And I'm seeing some people joining from all over the country, which is fantastic. Thanks for sharing that. And then I have another question for you. I'd love to know a little bit. I'm not really sure this is fair to consider it an indication of your careers, maybe an indication of your publishing career. I'd like to know if you're somebody who's published academic papers. And I'm making no judgment at all on whether or not it's a good thing. But I'd love to know if you've published no papers at all, maybe a few, or maybe lots. If you want to give me numbers, you're welcome to, but I couldn't tell you. And welcome from California. I hope it's sunny there. Good news. So yes, please do drop in the chat something about whether you're somebody who publishes lots of academic papers, or perhaps not at all, or perhaps a few. And I'd love to see your answers to that. Fantastic, thank you. Isn't that sense? Who's Zaid who said not enough? No, somebody did. Who's that? Jay. Yes, I think we all feel like not enough, especially when our deans are on the call. Okay, so I'm seeing some highly accomplished and published academics, and many of us who would like to publish more and struggle, and many of us who perhaps have just started on a career of publishing. So thank you very much for telling me a little bit more about you. So let me move on now and tell you a little bit about myself and my centre's work. And I hope it's okay to start with a personal story, because I think when we think about research impact, it's often about the people. It's about you sitting around your heater with your beanie or your air conditioning, thinking about your work and how you contribute and what kinds of things you produce, which is why I wanted to know a little bit about your papers. So I was born and grew up in Malawi. I'm sure some of you know it well as well, and perhaps it's new to others. But depending on what scale you look at, almost every rating of the poorest environments in the world pull Malawi up as one of the poorest countries. But of course, that's based on economics and not on many other scales. In many ways, Malawi is one of the friendliest and warmest places I've ever been, and certainly was my home for a very long time. But growing up in this environment, I had parents who were employed by a missionary organization. They were there for 13 years. My dad was a headmaster, a chaplain and a headmaster of one of the few secondary schools. And my mum, when she arrived as a newly trained doctor, was one of 12 doctors in the whole country. This is a picture from the late 1990s when we had gone back to Malawi on holiday, and the car was recognized. And immediately, a line of mothers and babies formed at the little cottage where we were staying by the lake, because they knew that there was a doctor in town. So I grew up with parents who spent a lot of their lives trying to make a difference with their careers. And despite the cute picture of the nurses' costumes, that's me with a stethoscope, I'm looking just a little bit younger. I knew I wanted to try and make a difference to the place and the continent that I loved, but I have to admit I didn't want to be a doctor. And I struggled with that for a while, because I knew that the poverty and inequality around me are not okay, and I wanted to make a contribution, but I wasn't sure how. I found that I could be clever and I could do research and I could get qualifications. And for a while, I thought that that might be the answer. And then I realized that perhaps it isn't after all. And I can tell you a little bit more about that later on. But as part of that journey of trying to think about how to make a difference and becoming an academic, I began to challenge myself with how being an academic might make a difference. And I started working in an area known as evidence-informed decision making. And in 5 years ago, I formed the Africa Centre for Evidence. So I went from one person trying to think about how doing research might help to actually make a societal impact through to a larger team. Unfortunately, they've cut the grass now, but this is what our offices looked like for most of 2020 and 2021. We're based at the University of Johannesburg, and this is my team. In January this year, we all managed to get back together again, which was fantastic. So now I lead a team. There's around 20 of us from across Africa, mostly based in South Africa, supporting the use of evidence in decision making and working very closely with government here to try and make sure that research evidence is useful and used. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how we do that now. So before I move on, I want to talk a little bit about motivation because it's I think the heart of much of this work. And I know I grumble, so bear with me, but it comes down to the fact that things are not okay. It is not okay that we have such high rates of poverty and inequality in the country at the moment. And some of you will have seen this Time front cover before, which is horrendous, to be honest, and high rates of femicide and looting and all sorts of challenges that we face. I'm sure you've seen the figures, but up to around 30% of people in South Africa are hungry right now today, and I can imagine also very cold. And those things are not okay. We're academics. I see myself as an academic. I'm a professor at a university, and I'm paid by public money. So somewhere in the system, there needs to be a way in which I can contribute to tackling these problems. But the truth is we work in silos, right? So if we all talked about our academic training and the work we do, we could probably put ourselves into one of those silos on the top right of the screen. And we're not going to find solutions while we stay in our separate silos. So we need to tackle this challenge of isolation. And we kind of need to talk about turning the world upside down too. And many of you will have been involved in critiques around decoloniality, but also around who publishes science and whose science is listened to in decision making. And the exciting thing around working in the field of evidence-informed decision making is that some of the best innovations and exciting work is happening in the continent. And increasingly, there are people listening to what we've got to say from the global north and learning from what we're saying. The little logo here of the Africa Evidence Network is a network that I helped to form 10 years ago. We're 10 years old this year. And it's a network of nearly 4,000 people now from across the continent who are committed to trying to make sure that research evidence is useful and used. And they span government officials, researchers, and everybody in between. And we work really hard to try and tackle that isolation through that kind of networking. This is where it gets slightly more, maybe not controversial, but technical perhaps. So we argue strongly that relying on single studies is not okay. And I have training in systematic reviewing, which is how healthcare policy is largely made. But as we've all seen with COVID, single research studies and the exciting potential of findings are being shouted all over the place, whether it's Donald Trump advocating for some non-evidence-based healthcare treatment, or the MMR story, which some of you will know, where there was a study published in the Lancet a long time ago now that suggested that there was a link between the mumps, measles, and rubella vaccinations given to young children and developing autism. And it's been shown, and in fact, the doctor who published the paper has been struck off because of his unethical research, that he had taken a position and was trying to prove it, that he'd received money from the families, and that the sample he was working on was tiny. And yet, even in the last few years, when I've had a baby born in Johannesburg, my midwife took me aside and said, I might not want this jab because there's a link to autism. And it's not true. So these big single studies can have a massive impact on how we make decisions. And we know that relying on those single studies are not okay. We also know, and that my team at the Africa Centre for Evidence are experts at this, that we can collate the full evidence base and understand what the whole scientific base on a particular issue says. There are methodologies and approaches that we can use and that are available to us all. It's also not okay, if we really want to make a difference with our research, to set aside decision makers and ignore what they have to say. So whether it's colleagues in the NRF who work closely with Department of Science and Innovation, whether it's the colleagues in the President's Office who are leading on the delivery of the National Development Plan, whether it's our own decision makers in our cities or in our provinces, we can't ignore them if we want our research to make a difference. And in fact, we need to sit around the table. So I have a little cartoon here of this kind of fake democracy that says, you know, that's 4 yeses and 1 no, no, no 1,000 times. We can't corrupt the system. We actually need to be able to sit around the table. We can't also behave like children. And I hate to say this, but I think as academics, and I hold myself in just as guilty, we do this sometimes. We whisper the results of our research to one another, and we exclude others who should probably actually should be the people who are engaging with the research and who we're listening to and trying to make a difference. So I've given you the gloom and doom. Now let me tell you a little bit about the work that I do to try and increase the societal impact of research. And then I'm going to pass over because I'd love to hear responses and questions. But let me tell you a little bit more about what we do first. So I talked a little bit about how we try to make a difference by collating evidence for decision making. And we use particular methodologies. So there's this approach called evidence-informed decision-making. It's often based on systematic collation of evidence into systematic reviews or evidence maps. There's a whole technical language there, which I'm happy to expand on more, but I think to an extent we can also set aside. But we know that when policy decisions are made, and particularly when they're implemented, there is potential for them not just to shape better decisions, but also to enable us to avoid the waste of public resources because we're not investing in policies that don't work. Very small example, the early research evidence on COVID suggested that we should be deep cleaning our schools. And every time there was a COVID case, the school was closed for 24, 48 hours while the school was deep cleaned. And very quickly that science moved on and we knew it wasn't necessary. And despite that, many countries, not just South Africa, continued to invest and waste resources and close schools and damage our children's education because we believed that deep cleaning was the thing to do. But actually, we'd already learned better and we should have stopped. So if we can get these decisions based on the best available evidence, we should be able to avoid the waste of public resources. We should be able to encourage more effective policies. So one of the deep frustrations linked to COVID was that actually masks were cheap and effective, and yet people were investing in much, much more expensive and less effective policies when it came to preventing the pandemic. So South Africa gets a huge evidence-based tick for the way in which they handled not necessarily every element of the pandemic, but the way in which the mask mandate was introduced for so quickly and for such a long time. It also enables greater transparency. So you can, if you've got a paper trail, and when I say paper trail, I mean quite a complex system of paper trail. But if you've got a paper trail where the evidence has been collated and preferably is publicly available, then people can see what a decision's been made on and the potential for evidence-informed decision-making processes to increase transparency are great. And of course, that also leads to stronger democracy because you can share evidence and involve people in the decision-making. And the aim of all of this really is to try and reduce poverty and inequality. And these are all approaches that we advocate. Now, I mentioned earlier that I thought I was being terribly clever when I became an academic and I got my PhD from the University of London in 2007, which feels like a very long time ago. But I don't mean to blow my own trumpet, in fact, quite the opposite. When I went to submit my large brick of a PhD to Senate House in London, I was very pleased with myself. I had plans for a party that evening. Everything was in place. And when I showed up, there were these blue bricks propping up the doors, propping up the windows, piled all over everybody's desks, piled all over the floor. And I suddenly realized that my terribly clever thesis that I thought was going to change the world was probably not even ever going to be read. And if you go and look at your own libraries, you don't really want to know how few people have ever read your own qualifications, let alone your academic papers. So what we started to do at the Africa Centre for Evidence was to start to work on collating evidence bases in partnership with government colleagues. And this relationship of partnership has evolved over most of the last 5 years. And it started with bidding to funders from the global north and being asked to have a partner from a low or middle income country on our proposal. And we shook our heads and said, but we are in a low middle income country and we have potential to be leading this work. And if not leading it, co-leading it with colleagues from the global north. And the idea of merely having a partner whose capacity needed building was already out of date. That's shifted, I'm glad to say, towards working to support the use of evidence in genuine partnerships. And increasingly, South Africa has leadership in this area that has a global reputation and is really kind of taking the stage now. And a lot of that leadership has come. And I put here innovations by DPME. So if you're not familiar, that's the Department for Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation in Central National Government here. And they have really led the partnership working. So we moved from an approach where we sit down on a research project and say we want to collate the evidence on a particular issue of importance to you, and we start engaging with the stakeholders who are delivering the public services and using the public services and making policy about the public services to engage with us on how we set the framework for our research. So we moved from that kind of approach to much closer partnership, and partnerships that are driven from the centre of government, where they will say they are collating stakeholders and could we please come along as the methodology people. And our role has become a much more specific piece of supporting government to employ the methods around collating evidence to inform their policy. And I've got some examples for you a little bit later. And just to highlight that this really has become an area, and I think we could even claim that increasing the societal impact of research, the leadership and the innovation is sitting within our government and not within our universities, and that's a challenge for us. Now, if I've lost you and you're not quite sure what I'm talking about, I just want to show you in very simple terms what this is really about and why I think it's so important. Because I think this is how we work all too often. I think we have a busy and important researcher who is saying, anybody out there are good, let me tell you all about my research. And a busy and important decision maker who basically says, I have no idea who you are or why I might want to listen to you. And unfortunately, I think this is the reality of how many of us try to achieve societal impact with our work. Now, of course, if we take the body of research evidence that's produced and we take the important decisions that are being made in our communities and in our country at any one time, there is overlap. And this is where we want to be. And this is what we need to start to maximize. This space in the middle where the research evidence that's being produced is useful and used and timely and overlaps with the important decisions that are being made on a daily basis. So this is what we're really talking about when we talk about societal impact and different technical approaches to achieve it. So we are trying to rise to this challenge of making a difference. We work at the Science Policy Interface. We absolutely believe that working together with decision makers and to an extent to service providers and service users as well is really important. We firmly believe that you have to put the policy leads at the centre of our research agendas if we want our research to be considered by those policymakers who are making decisions. So the centre of the world is not us, is not our universities, and is not our A-rated academics. The centre of the world is the policy needs and the decision makers' needs that we can help to inform. And then, of course, there is something about being responsive and timely and relevant, and that's increasingly challenged. I have been growled at by academics when I say that your beautiful, rigorous, first quality scientific study is useless if it's 1 hour late for the policy decision that really needed those findings. So we really need to take that seriously around thinking about what counts as rigor in academic science. And of course, and unfortunately, I think increasingly because of the pandemic, we need to think as well about how we can defend good science and not advocate for bad science at the same time. So we need to be really good at being methodologists and critiquing science and ensuring that good science is listened to. The principles we work to are this idea that a single study is not enough, that research methods have to be appropriate for the questions being addressed. And I'm kind of chuckling as I say that because it seems absolutely obvious, but I can tell you that as soon as you start to critique published research studies, you'll see that this is a huge issue and there are real problems with not just the way in which research is conducted, but also the way in which it's designed in the first place. And to be relevant, we have to really understand the needs for evidence. we have to be able to engage with these priority issues around things like time and scope and audience. So how do we approach our work at ACE? And I tried to think of this, maybe you're not an elephant, maybe you're an eagle, maybe you're at the beginning of your career and trying to think how to take off in this area. But when we think about how we approach this, I really do think we need to start with what's not okay in our world. What is it that bothers us? What is it that our decision makers are trying to tackle and the problems they're trying to solve? And really thinking that through is often a really good starting point for trying to think about how we can have an impact with our research. The second thing I think is really important, and we try and use in our work, is to really understand the decisions and the decision makers' needs. It's really easy, and I have made this mistake myself many times, to think that when I go and engage with decision makers, my role is to teach them about research. And actually, over and over, I've learned it's not. It's to be quiet and to listen to them and to learn about the decisions they're making and the realities with which they work within. We work always to closely map out the framework for investigation. It's often interventions and outcomes. It's kind of what are the key elements of those, but it can also be more sophisticated or varied or exploratory. And then I think there's two key things. One of them is about being confident about what we know already in terms of systematically mapping the existing research. We shouldn't be doing a research study that somebody else has already duplicated numerous times and we already have an answer. We need to be sure that what our research is doing is filling a gap, and we need to be able to engage stakeholders at every step. So I've got 4 slides just to run through the approaches that we are using in practical ways. And then there's a chance for a pause and some questions. So let me just tell you a little bit more about the 4 pillars of the work that we do. And I hope in the same way can introduce you to some of the ideas that underpin what I work on, and I hope that might be helpful for you. So the first one is this idea around evidence capacities. And the biggest initial grant that got our work going and enabled us to really start to invest in supporting government in South Africa to use scientific evidence and to think about this stuff was called a grant from the UK government to build capacity to use research evidence. And that we almost immediately shifted away from this deficit model towards thinking about building capacities to move away from building capacities and to move towards sharing and learning together. So we think about an evidence ecosystem, and I think you might have other ways of phrasing this. Sometimes we talk about national systems for innovation. Sometimes we talk about the kind of research policy gap. You'll hear people talk about knowledge brokering and knowledge translation. But essentially what we mean when we talk about the evidence ecosystem is this whole process, the systems for knowing, the systems for generating research findings, for publishing all those beautiful papers that you guys have been working away at, but also for thinking about how decision makers commission evidence, demand evidence, and integrate it into their decision-making processes so that when they make a policy, they're also considering its implementation, evaluating and monitoring it, and all the way around the cycle towards reviewing and trying to understand what works to inform what they're doing. So there's a whole system in place, and we need to be able to think about the whole system and the capacities within it. And those can be capacities, and I'm talking to groups of individuals, those are capacities as individuals, what we're trained at and able to do. Even things like how we talk and the language we use when we engage with government and other decision-making groups. I've learned so much from my colleagues in the DPME who have taught me simple things like, perhaps simple, but important things, like perhaps it's not just a science policy interface, perhaps it's a policy science interface, and all sorts of other very subtle but meaningful differences. And of course, those capacities are also at organizational and systems level. And I think probably, and I'm not saying this of your university specifically or South Africa specifically, but we have a broken academic system when it comes to ensuring our research evidence and our reward systems are appropriate for encouraging use. So we tend to reject this idea of building capacities and recognize that none of us have the answers. What we need to do is a bit like this Rubik's. We all bring a different color to build a block. It's not about uniform, and it's a good thing that it's not about uniform because I took that picture and I'm not very good at Rubik's Cubes. So we also firmly believe, and this is about tackling those silos, that we need communities, whether communities of practice or networks, to break down those silos and ensure that we understand each other. So just for a moment, I have one next to me in the office here. Just imagine a really big jigsaw puzzle and recognize that your work, and in fact, probably your discipline's work, is just one of those pieces of the jigsaw. In order to achieve the entire picture, where science is being generated and used and is useful and critiqued and challenged and published, all of those things, we need the whole jigsaw. Each piece is important. You can't build a jigsaw when you're missing a piece. None of us can work in isolation. We need to understand a common picture, and we need to recognize and respect what one another brings to the table. It's not necessarily knowing every single piece in the jigsaw, but at least knowing the pieces around you and how you connect to them is essential. And I mentioned the Africa Evidence Network earlier. That's really what that's about, trying to help to facilitate those connections. I talked about evidence synthesis, and I realize it's a technical area of work and might not be one you're familiar with. But I thought, and I often use this analogy, there's a nice way of thinking about this. So many of you will know this fantastic Nigerian author, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She has a TED Talk, and if you haven't seen it, please Google it and take 10, 15 minutes to listen to her, because she talks about something called the danger of a single story. And what she's talking about essentially is racism and stereotypes. And what she says is the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And I would argue that when we take one research study, we're introducing the same kind of problem. It's not necessarily that the findings of that single study are untrue, but they are incomplete, and they make one study become the entire evidence base. And we have mechanisms, evidence maps, rapid reviews, systematic reviews, for understanding what the full scientific evidence base says. And those become really important if we're going to avoid this pitfall of a danger of a single story. So we have a whole body of work around evidence synthesis and taking these methodologies and ensuring that they're useful and used. And some of the real specialists in this area are sitting within our government, and we work very closely with them. And then the last area is perhaps the more academic one, around trying to understand more about how to achieve societal impact, how research evidence can be useful and used. It's sometimes known as the science of using science, but we like to think of it as the art and science of evidence use, because often the work that is done across the continent and in South Africa in particular is fantastic. A lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, but it's not been published in a scientific paper. And that's why we have that art in there as well. So what we're really doing here is we're really trying to continuously contribute to and question, what do we know about how to support evidence use? What do we know about trying to ensure that evidence is useful and used, and that we can achieve societal impact with our work? So this is really about the importance of working and learning together for impact. These models of co-production and co-learning that are so tightly intertwined, of asking over and over, what does the evidence say about this? How can we achieve societal impact? What is the research on this? But also, what's our experience? And we realize that experience piece is particularly important across the continent and low middle income countries. And we have started to document with colleagues across the continent some fantastic learning about achieving societal impact. So we need to be asking ourselves continuously, are we learning, documenting and sharing as we go along? And just before we close, so some of my colleagues who work in this field, and I have been guilty of this as well, we're very good at writing about how the system for evidence use should be more developed. And what we really mean by that is we're looking at government and we're trying to critique and essentially tell them what to do into strengthening their systems for using research evidence. And we were challenged about this, and along with some colleagues at ACE and from within DPME, we recently wrote a paper around transforming this evidence for policy, this science for impact work, to instead turn the lens in and look at our own universities and academic systems to explore whether we've really got the system in place that should be there for evidence generation, for research generation. Because if we're just generating papers for the sake of papers, because we all judged by how many papers we write, me included, so I'm not dissing that by any means. I absolutely understand it. But if we've got those value systems and reward systems wrong, then we have a problem. So we recently wrote a paper around this, and I put a link at the end of the slides to share because we were trying to tackle this question about what might we do. Now, I've been talking for quite a long time, and I'd really love to open the floor. So I wonder if we can pause, and maybe I can pass over to you, Chair. I have another 5 or 6 slides we can go back to perhaps a little bit later, but maybe I can pass over to you to help explore maybe some questions and answers, etc. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for that exhilarating presentation, and of course, the challenge that you pose. Of course, I hope that colleagues, you're ready with questions or comments, and or even just your own contributions as in terms of your own experiences. But perhaps while you're thinking about it, let me just make a comment and observation, and then maybe ask a question or two to Ruth to expand on. Yes, we appreciate, and increasingly so. I mean, again, I want to reemphasize, I know that some of you, maybe we met the last time. I recently retired from the National Research Foundation. My few years as an academic in the year before joining the NRF, yes, of course, I was like you, and essentially the life was, the days of publish or perish. As Ruth indicates, the emphasis about being judged by the papers. But increasingly, I think there is more and more emphasis, and of course, having moved, and that's why I referred back to the NRF, we are all indicating to people, and you as academics, to say, yes, we know, whether you're dealing with a very minute or very, very dedicated natural science kind of, issue, what difference does it make to society eventually? And maybe that's where that particular puzzle or that particular, puzzle that Ruth is referring to comes in, because each one of us has a little bit to contribute. It's, if you tell one story, if you have one particular story, or one particular research, then, to my mind, I think the story will be very hard to come by. Nonetheless, Ruth, how do you try and coax, for the lack of a better way, people to work with, whether you are dealing with fellow researchers, in order to create this idea that we are all singing and pushing researchers to co-design with society, co-design with the government, and then co-produce the knowledge and perhaps facilitate the policy making? How do you bring those together in your experience from the work that you have done before, and or in fact going forward? What can you say about, how can you, not necessarily just as advice, but perhaps experiences that you have had? Let me stop there.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's a really interesting question because it's not always easy to know where to start. So my background before I started doing this work was working with Professor Sandy Oliver, who is now a distinguished visiting professor at UJ, and she started off as a lay participant in research. She was somebody who helped to train traditional birth attendants for during birth. So these are women who go and help other women when they're giving birth. And she got interested in research. And so she started finding out who was doing research in this area and going and speaking to them about what was important to her and the women she took care of. And that progressed to being an entire career that was about saying we need to go and talk to people at the bottom of the pile when it comes to power and decision making about their real lived experiences on the topics we're researching. So she trained me in a kind of a methodology within healthcare research called patient involvement in research. And there's research about it, and there's methodologies for it. But what it really meant was, for example, if we were doing some research around tests that are done on newborn babies, it was my job to go and find out from health professional organizations and charities that support families whose children have those conditions that are tested for, to go and not just speak to them about the research we were doing and what their priorities were. So these are not research participants. These are stakeholders whose views were important in shaping the research. And not just to go and speak to them, but to invite them around the table. And then to sit with them around the table and help them to have a voice. Because when there's a professor at the table or a doctor at the table or a director something at the table, it's really tricky for families who have had a particular personal experience to share. So it was my job to help them to speak, help them to make sure they had a voice. They knew who was going to be there. This Andrew guy, he's not scary. It's okay. You can put up your hand. Like a whole very much coaching and coaxing to encourage people. So that was my beginning experience of trying to think about stakeholders and bring them to the table. My advice would be that there's often organizations who will support the process. So if you're doing research about smallholder farming, well, there's going to be an organization of smallholder farmers in the Eastern Cape. And you can go and talk to them. You don't have to go find a farmer. You don't need to go speak to an individual necessarily. You can go find an organization. And those organizations or support groups, etc., exist all over the place. In terms of our work in government, it's been a very, very long time of building relationships and building trusted relationships and being reliable. And in fact, I had a lovely call with one of our colleagues in DPME today, and we were reflecting on how being willing to show up for each other and listen and not laugh when we shared challenges we were facing has built trust, and that's given strength to that. So sorry, that was a long answer, but I hope that answered your question. Chair, I can't hear you for some reason. I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
I see you speaking.
I
no
see
problem.
Zahid Wahid had a comment about policy and of course the issue of being critical in terms of even the policy that there is. While we have all these policies like RDP and the National Development Plan, Wahid, I mean, Saeed, you want to extend that particular input and or challenge the colleagues that are on here in terms of what we can expect?
Yes, Prof, thanks for that. So what I was alluding to is that if we, of course, policy is significant, particularly in South Africa, but if we start scrutinizing the most important policies that we have had since 1994, which include the Reconstruction Development Plan, Growth, Employment and Redistribution Strategy, and more recently the National Development Plan, the issues that we've had is that of policy implementation. And if you look at much of what has been implemented thus far is that government has essentially lacks the capacity to successfully implement these policies. And yes, I do agree that policy is important, but we do need to be very critical about it as well.
Thank you very much. Jai, I see you challenged, Matabo, and you are reflecting the issue of course, the impact making a difference, and in terms of asking ourselves or yourselves as researchers, what is it that you are doing and what impact will it make? Your question is essentially the promotion criteria in university. Does it differ from anything beyond the impact? Because my sense of it is that increasingly, the measure of impact has expanded from just the so-called scientific or bibliometric impacts and citation impacts. We are all even asking to say what social impact is it making? You want to comment, Jai, on that particular issue, and perhaps if Ruth, you want to come in?
Thanks, Prof. Yes, I think things are starting to change, but I'm just thinking about a discussion we had at our university.
Which is, please just refer to if we can, your university.
It's WITS.
Okay.
I'm at WITS. And one of the things they talked about is the number of publications people need to have to get promoted, for instance, to associate professor. And they gave a minimum number as 20 since your last promotion, of course. And I think one of the things for me, and perhaps because my publication record isn't very high, is that I think I tend to agree with exactly what Ruth was saying, that you need to publish something that's going to be relevant, that's needed, and that's required, and that has a clinical impact. It's pointless publishing about how fast someone's tongue, for instance, moves, if it's not needed and it's not going to have a desirable or required outcome. But you're so torn sometimes because you also want that promotion, and you know that the numbers of articles and publications you have and which journals they published in is also important. And I think now with universities motivating us to go for NRF ratings, I think it's introducing a different sphere where you are being evaluated by peers locally and internationally. So it is showing that your research, or you're getting more evidence that your research is being acknowledged as being relevant. So I think there is a trend to move, but often you're caught in the middle because you just want to publish volumes and volumes of journal articles, but actually are they relevant? And for me, that's a bit of an issue.
Okay, can I just challenge you without necessarily turning this into you know, a conversation between you and I, and then again maybe opening it up. And I'm glad that you probably are pushing the idea that things are changing, because even when I'm not at WITS and I'm not an academic anymore, but increasingly, what makes a difference? You know, is it just the number of those particular, you know, publications, as WITS would say, or the difference those particular papers make, either in terms of the knowledge field that you're dealing with, or in fact in society? Just like, and I think that is where, in many instances, one would even defend, you know, much as we admonish sometimes the subsidy issue, which of course Dr. Kate Menon is very familiar with, and all of you are at the Department of Higher Education and Training. They don't just count the numbers of publications. They count those publications that make a difference, whatever the difference is. As you rightly point out, one of the arguments about the NRF, people say, well, but the NRF just wants to be people to concentrate. The emphasis has, is on impact, to such an extent that if that impact is expanded beyond just citation impacts, but also to what difference it makes to the society in a particular field, perhaps that's what you guys would be more revolutionary to do, don't you think? What is the thinking about, perhaps colleagues that are out there? I'll still try and pick up some comments while we proceed. There are comments that people have made. Any thoughts about my remarks?
Can I come in, Chair?
Please go ahead, Ruth.
I don't mean to be too difficult, Chair, but I'm afraid my vote is with Jai's. I think the ability to communicate clearly our findings, the ability to share with the wider world, the ability to contribute to scientific knowledge, all those things are important. And so publishing is important, it has a place, but unfortunately, and this is true for all academics all over the world, it is given too much weight. And individual single author papers are given too much weight. I published 17 papers with my team so far this year, a very big team, so don't be too impressed, but 17 papers. It translates to 3 units and my dean is on my back. That's not enough units, Ruth. Well, I could have published 17 single author papers, but that would have been a disaster in my opinion and a disaster for my field. So I do think there's too much weight given to papers. And maybe it's not so much about changing the need to publish, but rebalancing it so that we can take into account the importance of other things, of really giving a badge, right? So maybe those who rate us and those kind of things do consider impact. But there's no badge for partnership. There's no badge. There's nothing I can count and report to my dean or report on my CV in quite the same way, with quite the same weight. So I'm afraid my vote tends to. with Jai, but I don't. Others may disagree, and I know in some sciences it can vary, right? As well, I'm a humanities academic, so maybe it's different in other fields.
I see a hand by Asanda. Asanda, you want to make some input? I can't agree more, Ruth. Of course, I think we can come back to that, but let me ask Asanda to make some input.
Thanks, Prof, and thanks to Ruth for that enlightening presentation. But I have one question. Do you find, because earlier on you indicated that we should work with, lawmakers, but do you find that rewarding in the sense that it's quite common for lawmakers, to be advised, by scientists, by researchers on what they should do? A case in point will be COVID-19. There were various instances whereby, the scientists would say government has to do this, but, the politicians, they went their way and did their own things. So do you find, working with policymakers, lawmakers, especially in South Africa, rewarding? Because at the end of the day, you'll be happy to go to sleep knowing that your suggestions have actually been used. And it can be very frustrating, I should think. So I just want to comment on that. Thank you so much.
Can I come in, Chair?
You want to respond to that?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. I didn't mean to jump my slides, but I've got some examples, and perhaps I can take 5 minutes and run through some more in a minute.
Sure.
But my short answer is, it's fantastic. I love working with South African government. It's extraordinarily rewarding. I can give you a number of examples, and I have one in these slides, which perhaps I'll go through in a moment. But I'm not an individual taking the findings of an individual piece of research to government colleagues. I'm working with the system for integrating science into policy, and I'm taking an offering of a collated evidence base to decision makers. And at the systems level, we have some beautiful examples of how we've enabled policy to be made in a more integrated way that is based on the science. Chair, I don't know if it's a good time. Can I jump in and run through some more slides? Would you like to?
Yes, sure. That's the idea. Ruth, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. And I see those comments come in the chat too, so I don't want to ignore those.
We'll come back to to the comments. Just go ahead and
fantastic. So just a little bit more detail if you'd like to know some more. And so I talked a little bit about knowledge synthesis and different approaches and what we do. So just imagine for a moment, scientific knowledge is a crop. It's doing well. There's lots that needs to be harvested. You can jump in this field and select individual pieces from the crop and write a literature review. You can, that's top left, bottom right, you can do a full systematic review. This is a team, this is expensive. You go in and you find every single piece of research and you interrogate it and you summarize it, and it takes at least 12 months and a big team of people. And that's what happens with regards to a lot of the health policy that is introduced, and people spend a lot of time doing those. There are libraries of them, you can go find them, they're great. I highly recommend going to find the libraries and make the most of all that work others have done. You can do rapid reviews, and there were a lot of rapid reviews done during COVID, where we jumped in the field with fast teams, we worked through the night and we collated the evidence. And there are teams that are still doing this as new vaccines come on the market and questions around whether under 5s should be vaccinated, etc. So there are teams continuously jumping into this field and harvesting this crop as fast as possible. What we do with our government colleagues is evidence maps, bottom left. This is about pulling the evidence into structured ways and providing it to them using a particular set of software that allows you as a decision maker to dive in and explore what research has been conducted in relation, usually on a matrix, but in relation to particular areas. So this is the methodology that we've developed alongside colleagues, and that's the product that we take when it comes to decision making. And here's an example. So this was a piece of work we did around early grade maths education. And you end up with the interventions. I know you can't read the details, so please don't worry too much, but the interventions are one axis and the outcomes on the other. And within each of these are bubbles, and the bubbles represent the size of the scientific evidence base within them. And then depending on the nature of the piece of work that we've done, the colors might indicate quality, or they might indicate country or origin, or perhaps some area of topic. We can code those according to what's needed. The example I wanted to give you in response to that last question was a really exciting piece of work that we got to do around land reform. So early 2019, the president announced a technical advisory group and a report and all about land reform very quickly, that he needs answers. And he appointed a number of specialists to write their chapters on what they recommended around land reform. Now, I think the president knew, and so did all the rest of us, that these people all had strong positions in particular areas, and they were going to take particular positions in their recommendations. So he also appointed from the Department of Environmental Affairs a technical team. And the technical team was writing a technical report that was going to underpin the key advisory committee's report. The technical team knew us, and this is where the relationships and the collaborations come in. They knew us from previous work we'd done within the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and they came to us and said, please, collate the science for us on land reform. We need it. We need to quickly be able to dip in and out of what the science says on issues so we can explore and challenge and document where the recommendations are coming from. So we produced an evidence map. This is a file that you can email to you, and you can open on your computer, and you can click on these bubbles. So we went away and systematically searched, according to the framework that had been set out for us, the research evidence from key countries as specified by the government's technical advisory group. And this map was then taken away by the technical advisory group and one of our researchers to inform this report. And what happened was they had a writing retreat, and my researcher, who had helped in this process to rapidly collate all the research evidence on key issues, sat alongside the technical advisory group. So when they're writing the chapter on land demand and beneficiary selection, he could interrogate the research evidence on this column here around what research do we have on that issue. So they worked together to produce that report. So that kind of investment in a system, to work with a system, has been incredibly rewarding. And I hope that answers that question a bit. Just one last little piece, a couple more slides. So we have for a very long time been producing these maps in partnership with government to help answer policies. And there's been a whole range of them. So grade R mathematical teaching with colleagues in Department for Basic Education, inclusive innovation with Department of Science and Innovation, water stewardship with Department for Water and Sanitation, human settlements policy. We've done this map twice. The first time we collated the evidence on human settlements, it was taken straight to Cabinet as part of the argument for why the white paper that had been drafted was not appropriate, because the position within the white paper was a completely empty row. There was no research, positive, negative, good or bad, on that particular area. So the white paper was thrown out and a new one was drafted that was based much more closely on the evidence. The land reform example that I just gave you, and a whole set of other we call them responsive evidence services, so a whole set of delivery of these services. But what we're now doing is recognizing that we need to start to think about system strengthening. So we know that there's a system around policy development and a system around the generation and collation of evidence. And that ACE has a role to play alongside many other units that do this work inside and outside of government to collate evidence to inform policy. We integrate through the centre of government, and we're very closely linked. And if you don't know the SEAS system, I recommend you have a look at it, critique it, engage with it. It's called the Socioeconomic Impact Assessment System, and every new policy or amended policy that goes before Cabinet from South Africa, particularly at a national level, but also more widely, in theory at provincial and local levels as well, has to go through this system twice, where the policy positions are laid out and the evidence for and against are presented. And we're now working to try and strengthen how this system is implemented, and have been working with colleagues in the centre of government to write a guide and support its implementation around scientific evidence use within the SEAS. And of course, there's external processes as well that we're engaging with. And Andrew and you and others know much more around production of research evidence and NRF and valuing and some of these many things you've been talking about. And that's the end of my extra slides. There's a whole set of extra links that I can share with you. And Chair, I think I should be quiet and pass back to you. Thank you very much for allowing me those extra few minutes to share.
Ruth, thanks very much for that input. I saw some comments from Sabelo. Did you have anything you wanted to add? I know there's been a conversation in behind talking about the subsidies and so on. But again, I think if we go back to just looking at how much, the differences and in terms of the impact that is made from the work that people actually do. Any further comment from you, Sabelo?
Oh, sorry. Oh, you're asking me. Oh, sorry. My brother stole my earphones at some point, so I didn't hear anything.
Okay, sorry.
No, I was just saying that it seems that, I don't know, I'm not sure how people do it in other universities, but it seems that subsidies do encourage researchers to publish. In that if you know that you will get some portion of the money that comes back to the university for every publication, and that comes back directly into your research grant, then you're more likely to publish, right? But while in UCG the policy is that that's not, we don't get any money back. It goes back into the main part of the university. In fact, researchers don't get any of that money back. Sometimes it comes to departments, but I think that as far as it goes, but it never goes back to individual researchers. So I think the discussion was really, or the debate was around whether whether that would encourage researchers to publish more. But I think, basically they're saying that, well, that shouldn't be your main driver, that you're gonna get subsidies back.
Any other comments or questions, colleagues? While colleagues are thinking about questions, Ruth, one of the tricky parts is, of course, we talked about getting the partnerships, and of course, once you start working with government and I think there's a lot of ears. I know that government wants fast solutions, and I think you made reference to this, that for us as researchers and you as academics, there's the tendency to say, well, you want to a thorough research, and the policymakers or decision makers say, well, you are taking too long. We want to make a decision and make a political statement, as it were. But be that as it may, how do you align people, especially in terms of the kinds of creating teams that you think would be more useful in terms of academic enterprise, and of course in terms of working with the policymakers?
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's interesting that some of the chats, the contributions, and also from your experience, I'm sure with the NRF, we've been highlighting how money makes the world go round, right? So I think there's something around thinking, and I think funders can drive this, thinking about in requiring cross-disciplinary and multidisciplinary work, and rewarding it, because the world's problems are not generally, in those silos in which we work, despite that. And I think there's ways in which funders can enforce that. Who are you partnering with? This is cross-disciplinary, a grant. We require you to work across organizations. And actually that funding is not the only answer, but funding really can drive this. And the more that we can engage, it's probably more than just a triangle of academia and funders and government, but there are certainly three key players there, and the more that we can be on the same page and think about the incentives we're using, I think the closer and the easier it is to start to form those relationships. I hope that answers a kind of quick answer on that.
No, we'll come back to funders and driving that, especially the collaboration part, but I see Jai has got a hand up. Jai, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Prof. Yes, I was just wondering, just thinking about the social impact and relevance of research, and how we position funding applications and articles and things like that. Is there, and I think individually, each of us on this program will start spreading the information and content we're getting from the FPP program into our different departments and faculties in terms of how thinking about future professors is changing, and the social impact of what we're doing and those kinds of things. But is there perhaps, and I'm just thinking out loud, is there perhaps something from the conveners or who, like with Prof Menon and stuff, is there some feedback that's given to the different universities in terms of what the thinking of the future professor is, that goes back to the universities, so that universities start thinking more about how they're wanting to shape professors across the different faculties, across the different departments? Because I mean, it's impossible for the FPP to go out to every single person going forward, every single academic. And so it almost seems that it needs to be a message that comes down from the university. And I think the FPP program is such a brilliant way of doing it. But I'm thinking, is it going to reach everyone? And I think another point that I wanted to just raise is, often when we do funding applications, we often talk about the sustainable development goal, but personally, I don't know about the needs of government in South Africa. And I think there was a comment about that earlier. And perhaps there does need to be a bit more of a focus on the needs of our context and the policy needs, what the government needs are. Because I think that would make it more relevant as well and substantiate what the universities are then wanting to do. Thank you.
In a way, Jai, I think that's a challenge that you quote unquote, with, not in terms of age, but you young and future professors have the challenge to change, the world. I know it's a very big ship that has to be tend, and it takes a while to tend that particular ship. But, and unless that kind of, sense and like Ruth indicates, where do we put our money? And, in order to say to ourselves, we are making a difference. I have seen governments, even in the South African government, and of course, some of you may be aware in terms of what, in the UK and everybody is doing. There is a lot of emphasis about what impact is your intended research going to make. And when we have put that on the table, we have no idea in terms of other, the assessment of that impact, other than, of course, the impact that we have all known to say, well, the citation is that and this and that. So increasingly, the challenge comes back again to people like yourselves, because if we get evidence like what Ruth is advocating here, that in fact, when we do this with government, it makes a difference in terms of how they do things, then we start finding ways of measuring that to such an extent that you can always say to yourself, I don't just have to have 20 papers which are simply published, but maybe even 2 or 3 that have made critical, difference in what society is looking for. As you are saying, in terms of even this sustainable, development goals, because at the end of the day, they constantly, even I know, like, as maybe Ruth can again reflect on the Department of, Monitoring and Evaluation in terms of in the presidency. The idea was always, and it's been increasing, to show to what evidence can we show that we are making a difference in terms of what we do. How do we do that? I think it's essentially then, what are you as researchers saying to us as the lay persons, to government, to say, look at us. We came together in order to address this particular problem. We didn't just have the social scientists or the chemistry people, or whatever the case may be, but in working together and with you, we actually have achieved this particular. It's a challenge, but I think that's where, and even for those that have the money and or funding agencies, for instance, like the NRF, must start shifting. They shifting the resources to say there has to be also in the proposal to say money not just for the product, but money to input to facilitate that kind of coming together. Because in many instances, I'm one of those persons, having spent years in there, that we probably in many instances, they've never thought or spent time to say, let's put more money first for even organizing yourselves than the paper in the, the output. Because in many instances, I think the difficulty is that, getting people together becomes even more difficult and requires more resources and time than perhaps somebody sitting on the desk and writing a paper and publishing it and getting a subsidy. So it's almost like an egg and chicken situation that way. But again, we have to find ways and means and constantly engaging in it. I see some comments. While I have those comments, are there any questions or comments from people as I try and read through the comments that are sent in the chat?
Perhaps I can share a little story, Andreas, from the NRF.
Go ahead, Ruth. Yeah.
We interestingly, so there were two things that were worth sharing. I got pulled into one of these meetings of professors at UJ once. I was literally grabbed from one room and brought in, come, the NRF are here and they want to talk about research infrastructure and we need you, come join the discussion. I'm sure it's happened to all of you, and if it hasn't yet, it will. The interesting thing was I talked about how we try and work to contribute to achieving the National Development Plan. And your colleagues from the NRF came to me straight away afterwards, and they said, we never academics talk about the National Development Plan or even thinking about it or trying to contribute to it or align to it. And and from that conversation, we continue to work together. So if you want to hook people into dialogue and conversation, we have to think about common language and what's important to them. And then linked to that, one piece that we did as a result of that, when we showed them those evidence maps, they said, do you think you could map how we're funding Sochi chairs and centers of excellence against the NDP for us? Just like a little confidential thing, we would really like to know where our funding is going into relation to the NDP. So in very small ways, all of us need to shift a bit, right? And we all need to kind of shift in connection to each other. It's like a whirlpool that gradually is approaching somewhere, and we must keep shifting together. And so it's been really interesting to have those engagements with colleagues in the NRF where we found a common language in the NDP, and then we found some common tools where we could map out and have a look and explore where's the money going. Thanks, Chair.
Perhaps to just add on that, one of the things and the challenge I was going to put across, something that I know a little bit more, not because it's a critical part, but the white paper on science and technology and innovation, was done 2 to 3 years ago. Now you've got what they've prepared as a decadal plan that will actually, has been written and prepared to identify themes and areas, but it also has provided, mechanics of how the government, at least from the Department of Science and Innovation, will be funding. And one of those areas that they are emphasizing, and again, it may well be out of these conversations that you have the Ruth Stewarts of this world and everybody talking about collaboration and so on, is essentially to put more money in collaborative effort rather than individuals. Yes, of course, you may ask and you may come to me and say, but the DSI and NRF themselves are the ones that create instruments like the chairs, which are just one single person and so on. That may be one. But if you go and take time, because, I just saw the final version and I was talking with the Director General of DSI, the decadal plan will soon be published. And in fact, it's available as a draft. You will find the opportunity in terms of, what it is and how does the department actually aim to, and government aim to invest their money, especially on collaborative effort, on collaborative research, because that's where they think they should be putting their money. So it will be interesting then for us to then say to ourselves, how does that translate to the high institutions of learning in terms of universities and the promotion process? Remember how promotion process in universities, yes, was always mainly, just research outputs and so on. And it took a long time, much as we do teaching and engagement and so on. it was just almost on the side issue until perhaps universities themselves started to think, well, people can also prepare teaching portfolios that we can assess and say to themselves, this is a fantastic teacher in the term or academic as a lecturer, as a professor, that in fact, that's a direction that you take. And not just necessarily, the fact that you are, you work on your own and you publish 100 papers without necessarily, sharing with anybody or even part and parcel of the teaching. But I challenge you and perhaps put across to you that if you have an opportunity, please take time. Like Ruth is saying, engaging with things like the National Development Plan, looking at those sustainable development goals and say to yourselves, how best can we be at this particular time? Colleagues, we are coming towards the end of our time, but if there are questions again and or any other comments, we can entertain so that we continue our conversation. Are there any pertinent points that people want to raise or comment or ask?
Prof. Ramesh,
I see. Ramesh, hey, I didn't realize you are here, my friend.
Yes, I am. Andrew, it's good to see you and good to chat to a fellow retiree.
Good to see you.
Yeah, let me say thank you for Ruth. I mean, that was a very, very good and a very strong presentation. Ruth, I met you some time ago, about 2 years ago, when I was working for the National Research Foundation, looking at national research infrastructure for the humanities.
Yeah.
But the point I want to make today is, and the premise for my point is that we are talking to a cohort and a generation of future professors. And the message I want to say is that, as our colleagues are listening, they may be wondering whether their particular piece of research at this point in time has any opportunities for social impact, social relevance. And I want to say that this is a question that may not necessarily apply to all our research. And I want to give a very good real life experience. My discipline is physics. And in 1905, Albert Einstein wrote 3 papers, very short papers, about 4 or 5 pages. He got the Nobel Prize, but any one of them would have got him the Nobel Prize. One of the papers he wrote is called the photoelectric effect. Essentially, if you take a little wind vane and you enclose it in a glass capsule, and you place that in the dark room, nothing happens. But when you take that wind vane and you place it in the presence of sunlight, it starts to rotate. Albert Einstein did the analysis of that. And through that analysis, he was able to show that light travels in little quantum. So there's a whole little packets of light that travels through this electromagnetic wave. At that time, it was explanation of a physical problem, and that's where it stopped in terms of understanding interpretation. But today, that piece of work that Albert Einstein did in 1905 is a fundamental principle that governs the operation of our photoelectric cells, that govern photovoltaic heating panels. And it's exactly one simple principle. So what I'm saying to say, a piece of research done at this particular time might be a beautiful contribution to knowledge, but it doesn't end there. As knowledge advances, as the interrogation and application of knowledge for societal benefit advances, then your piece of work today maybe become relevant 10, 15, 20 years from today. That's the point I wanted to make, Andrew. Thank you, colleagues.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, just to also remind you that please ensure that you complete the evaluation and just comments about this particular, the brown bag session that we have, and any suggestions that you may have. There is, of course, there's a link that Megan has posted. So if you can do that. Ramesh, thanks once again for that input. I mean, I think at some point, even with the so-called, very basic and or very scientific part, we forget that they can make a big impact. In fact, you guys in physics and of course even in astronomy and the work that you have done, and Ramesh, your work, makes a whole lot of difference. Because a few years ago, when everybody was dealing with astronomy, especially in this country, everybody would ask, and I remember always Minister Naledi Pandor would say, she wondered and always, was asked and said, what is astronomy going to do for people, for people's lives? But I'm sure we would spend the whole day and the whole afternoon here to see the difference that it has made in part of the Northern Cape, and the kind of work, and in terms of improving the mathematics, in terms of engineering among students, in terms of young people getting interested, a whole bunch of things that happen. In terms of just being forced to try and bring everybody together to make some solution. We are close to the end, and unless there is any very, other comments, may I just then ask Ruth if you've got the last remarks that you want to make, and then if Kate is still around, Dr. Menon, if we can perhaps say a few words before we close off. Ruth, you have any additional comments you want to make?
Only to say thank you very much. It's been such a privilege, and I wish you all the best with the program. And I think this room is full of people who are going to do really exciting things. I look forward to hearing more about it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Ramesh, I see your hand is still up. Is that the old hand, both literally?
Yeah, that's the old hand. Thank you.
Is Dr. Menon still around with us?
Yes, I am.
Would you like to just say a few words before we close off? Okay?
No, it's lovely to see such a full house, despite the ominous load shedding. And thank you very much, Prof. Stewart. That was absolutely fascinating and has given us more to think about as we continue on this journey, especially all our potential future professors in the room. And I think that we definitely would like to reopen this conversation again, to talk about it more individually, because each individual in this room has a particular contribution. And I'm sure they would love to have the opportunity to tease this out with someone with the kind of experience that you have shared with us. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much, Megan, and your team for, for organizing this. My apologies that I was on and off, for some reason. I wonder if it's just the code, because I was even going back and forth to my, fiber Wi-Fi for home, and also use the hotspot to try and work around the two, but I'm glad that we've managed. Megan, thanks very much. And colleagues, thank you very much for your engagement and attendance. And I hope that this has made a difference and your thinking going forward. So thank you very much, and have a good afternoon and the rest of the day. Cheers.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.